Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Parallel Systems broadcast live stream. I'm your host, Mike, and this is a bit of a, let's say, an emergency live stream or a celebratory live stream because I'm looking at the silver price right now. It is up 235% over the past year, and we are now over $100 per ounce. So, congratulations to everybody who has been enduring the silver space over the last 10 years. It's been very volatile and it's taken a long time to get to triple digit silver. But we are now here, and it's been fantastic for me to hear some of the stories. I've had people reaching out to me and tell me how much profits they've earned over the last few years in silver and how it's helping protect them and their families, giving themselves a nest egg for the future, allowing them to buy property. In fact, one of the people that I was working with, they managed to buy their property completely for free because a few years ago they put a lot of their money into gold and silver, and then just this year they cashed out some of it to buy a property, and the property was over 1 million, and they bought it essentially for free, and they've still got a big pot of gold and silver. That is the power of owning metals going into the end game of this. And this is something that we've been talking about for some time here on the channel. And obviously at the bottom there's gold and there's silver, and the idea was that going into the end game, what we would see is people start to rush down this pyramid into this tiny little base of metals upon which everything else rests. And that's because gold and silver are the real wealth of the system. Gold especially, that's money. Yes, silver has a monetary aspect to it. It's got a long history of being money, and it's the people's money. And yet today it's used as an industrial metal. Now, I think there is a chance that eventually it goes back to being the people's money. And I think we're seeing that now with lots of people buying gold and silver. And I've seen locally in the region where I live and in the cities around where I live, people are now talking about the metals again, and people are buying them. I was speaking to dealers in Central Europe. I was calling them up and just having a chat, and they said they've never been busier. Never been busy with people buying, and it's been that way for over 2 years, just month on month record sales in gold and silver, which is quite different. It's a contrast to what we're seeing in the US. I'm being told in the US that people are net sellers, that the domestic public at least are going in and selling their physical bullion. So, what's it all about? Why are people selling going into the most important time in history to own gold and silver? Well, I think it's psychology, actually. I think it's psychology because people in the West have had it very good for a very long time. And I say good, it's actually really tough to live in the West, especially the US right now, which is probably why a lot of people are selling because they just can't afford their bills. Inflation is absolutely nightmarish in the US. It's the same in Great Britain, it's the same in most of Europe. And so the people that were smart and were thinking ahead and were in gold and silver are now seeing the prices go up, and they probably want to hold on to it, but they can't because they need to pay bills. They need to pay for another car because their old car broke down or they can't fix it. They need to pay just for their mortgage or their credit cards. And that's really the truth of it. There's a lot of people in debt in the West, and there's a lot of people who can't afford to hold on to their gold and silver, which is why actually the most important thing we can do before we do anything to do with investing is to decrease the expenses and to downsize our life, and then maybe go back to living in a way that's a little bit more reminiscent of what our great grandparents would have had in the 1920s, 1930s, the Great Depression era. Tough people who lived on the land. 1 in 3 Americans lived on a farm back then. And so, even when the credit system collapsed and people were financially tapped out, they had very little to no debt. Some people did, they lost their houses. That's why getting rid of debt is so important. But the people who didn't and lived on a farm, they had very little debt to no debt, so they didn't have to worry about that. When the prices of things became very restrictive, they was producing it themselves. They had wood that they was chopping down for heating, for firewood. They had gardens out back, so they didn't have to depend on the stores or on buying from other people, which was really the problem in the Great Depression. It wasn't necessarily prices spiking. It was the fact that people became completely illiquid. Firstly, the money system tightened so fast. And secondly, the credit system collapsed. The whole banking system collapsed. So people couldn't even access money. Lots of people lost their accounts. So because they could produce these things at home, they could go outside and pick up some fruit or some um, vegetables from the garden. They had chickens for eggs. They had maybe a cow for milk. And they had these little self sustaining units, and everybody did. And so then they could trade and barter between each other. And if you go onto YouTube and listen to some people who grew up during this time, you can still find interviews with them. They say, you know what, I lived on a farm and it wasn't so bad. And yet we hear these nightmarish stories of the Great Depression where people were literally starving to death and you had unemployment over 25%. At the height of the Great Depression, over 60% of all mortgaged property was in foreclosure. Just think about that. That was during an era when people carried very little debt. What would that be like today when you've got places like California where the average salary is something like $90,000 a year and yet the average house price is nearly a million? It's going to be a catastrophe. So, I think that's why there's a lot of people right now selling the metals. And the other people who are selling the metals are those who just didn't understand why they was owning it to begin with. So they're tapping out. They've seen the prices maybe in 2012 where silver was up at $50 and maybe they bought in towards the peak. And so they've just been hanging on for over a decade, and now finally the price has gone up and they think, this time I'm going to get out at the top, this time I'm going to sell my metals, this time it's I'm not going to be fooled, I'm not going to lose my wealth, I'm going to sell and then I'm going to buy back in at the bottom. I'd be very hesitant to say that. Of course silver's going to have pullbacks, big pullbacks, because it's a volatile metal. That's normal. But I would say that we are getting very close now to the end of the system. And I was just speaking to someone a moment ago, and we was talking about this, and I said, the end of the system is something that's probably going to happen with an abrupt ending at some point. And that's really the risk, is that at some point, this whole thing starts to just come down. And we know that in that moment, their strategy is to take our assets, is the great taking, the derivatives and unfunded liabilities, the 2 to 4 quadrillion in them. Of course, there is no way to fix that. So at some point, there has to be some kind of event that gets rid of that, that allows that to deflate or, let's just say, catastrophically collapse. And if that happens, everything else in the system, from paper currencies to the derivatives complex at the very top, will also then start to collapse too. Now remember, the government bond section, which you can see is just up above paper currencies, that's 130, let's say $140 trillion worth of government bonds. That's actually the base layer of the system. When you look at this, you think, oh, it's gold and silver. No, gold and silver sit outside of the system. Then you've got land and commodities, which is the base of the next system. Because, of course, all real wealth comes from land. All commodities come out of land, including gold and silver. Money comes out of land too. So that's why we're seeing Donald Trump go around the world and say, we're taking Greenland, we're taking Canada, we're going to invade Venezuela or any country, basically, that's got stuff that America needs. Now, of course, Donald Trump isn't the important person here. He's kind of like the front man of a band. Remember when Guns N' Roses got rid of Axl and then they just had all of these dodgy lead singers? They'd go on tour for about 2 years and then be like, right, flip that guy out, get another one in. And they didn't really matter. That's kind of the US presidency. Although Donald Trump obviously has this big persona, he's a WWE character. And so that's the same for most politics, all politics, actually. So it doesn't matter about the people involved. What matters is that they are there to help usher in this reset and also to coordinate people around ideas and ways of thinking, because they don't want you figuring out what's happening. Because if you figure out what's actually happening, well, you wouldn't be selling your metals. You'd be buying more metals, especially gold, because of course the reset is working against gold or versus gold. And that's because all of this that is in this top part, as much capital as possible is going to rush down out of it into gold specifically. And then the people, because silver is the people's money, are going to look at gold at $5,000 an ounce right now and say, geez, yeah, I can't really afford an ounce of gold. Of course, you could buy gold in grams or whatever, but most people don't think like that. And they're going to say, but silver, well, silver, yeah, I can stretch to a few $100. It's still very expensive for a lot of people because you used to be able to get silver at $20 an ounce, However, most people will still be able to stretch for $150 when compared to an ounce of gold. And that's what will happen is people will rush down and silver will become the people's money again. Now, whether it's actually going to be put into the monetary system again, I have my doubts because they've spent the last thousands of years trying to eradicate silver from the monetary system. Gold too, but gold isn't quite so dangerous to them. And I'll tell you why in a moment. But silver is extremely dangerous to them. Silver is dangerous to them because I, as a farmer, could sell produce for silver. You know, a gram of silver right now, let's check the price of a gram of silver. Let's go back to our charts. Flip over to silver. And if we look at a gram of silver, right now, a gram of silver is $3.20. $3.20 for a gram of silver. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because with a gram of silver, you could buy some eggs, you could buy a coffee. It's about the price of a coffee, or maybe actually that's being generous because obviously coffee's gone up a lot as well. But it's about the price of, let's say, a coffee or a packet of cigarettes or a beer. So silver actually can be used in the real economy. And for me as a farmer, if somebody brought a few grams of silver to buy some eggs off me, I would readily take it because they're giving me something of value and I'm giving them something of value. So that's a good exchange. That's a great deal. Now, what we've got in this world is I'm being given debt. If somebody wants to buy from me, they're going to give me some notes, which are promissory notes. They're debt notes. It's a promise to pay. And of course, as this system collapses, as this big pyramid starts to fall apart, what we see is everything above, including and above paper currency, goes to zero. It disappears. It gets taken. The bank deposits get taken. Any wealth in the system gets siphoned off to the secured creditors. Government bonds, we're seeing those things collapse in real time. And this is why this time is different. We are seeing things collapse in real time. The Japanese government bonds have gone up thousands of percent increase over the last few years. The yen carry trade is going to unravel, and the base layer of the system, sovereign debt, is catastrophically losing value. And what that means is the derivatives complex, which is actually backstopped by the collateral, which is the sovereign debt, because it's collapsing in value, it means that bit at the top is unhedged and there's going to be margin calls in the system. And when they make margin calls, they're going to say the value of the collateral, which is the sovereign debt's collapsed, so you have to put up more collateral. Now, how do they do that? Well, they sell their safest assets, their most liquid assets, which is sovereign debt. So what that means is they're being margin called because sovereign debt's collapsing in value. So they sell more sovereign debt to put up more margin, but that collapses the value of sovereign debt further. And it's a vicious cycle. And eventually the whole system just unwinds catastrophically. Now, that's why I think they're going to try and control the reset. And I think we're living in the controlled reset. This is it. But at some point, there is still going to be a hard stop. So everything collapses. And then at that point, people could actually go back to using silver in the economy because it's valuable, but it's not so valuable that you couldn't use it in day-to-day transactions. Now, of course, if we contrast that with gold, if we've got even just a gram of gold, which remember is a very small piece of gold, a single gram, a gram of gold right now is $160. So yeah, that's a lot of coffee and it's a lot of eggs. Maybe not forever because of course the price of all those things are going up, but the price of gold is going up much faster. So a gram of gold, yeah, you couldn't really use that in an economy. You could use it for a bigger purchase. Maybe if you was buying a car, maybe if you was buying a house, you could use gold, but you couldn't use gold in day-to-day interactions, not just for paying the small things in the real economy. That's why they hate silver, because they know that silver is really a silver bullet to the fiat vampire. I think it was maybe Ron Paul who once said something like that. And that's what it is. It's very dangerous to the system. It's very subversive. So that's why they want people on digital currencies, on shitcoins and bitcoins, because they want people to believe that that's the solution, which is actually going backwards. It's actually debasing the system even further, because now you're moving something around that has zero value and is infinitely replicable. So that was the trick. And that's why I think it's going to be very hard to get silver back into the monetary system, because they are going to do everything possible to stop that. And there's nobody anywhere that I see that is seeking to do it. Now, does that mean that silver's worthless? Absolutely not, because it's still the people's money. And ultimately, the people get to decide. You can bring silver to me and I can sell things to you privately with no debt attached, exchanging things of value and therefore we've done a transaction and they can't stop that. So silver will always have that function. And I think if this system that we're looking at here breaks down catastrophically, you may well see places in the world where that is viable and feasible. Obviously, you need to be around people who are protecting their wealth in real assets, which is why it's very sad to know that there's people in the US selling their silver, selling their gold, because they believe that the train's going to stop. Well, it's not. The gold and silver train keeps going. The fiat train is the one that's going to stop as it smashes into a tunnel that's being concreted over. You know, like those old cartoons, and they'd paint on a brick wall, kind of a tunnel, but it wasn't. It was just painted on, and the train would go towards it. It would probably have one of the little characters in it, and they steamed into it and then just smashed into the wall. Well, that's the fiat system. They want you to think that there's a tunnel. You're looking and you're like, oh, I see there's a tunnel. We're going to continue for another decade, another 20 years. We're going to go through the tunnel and it's going to be happy days. No, that's not what's happening here. You're going straight into the tunnel. And that's going to be the reset. That's going to be the hard stop, is when we get to that point, because they won't have any choice. And, you know, if they want to put people into a financial, digital, technocratic surveillance and control grid, which is a long way of saying this kind of beast system, you ain't doing that voluntarily. And yet we're seeing them set up the pieces. Tokenization this year, it's being discussed by Larry Fink at Davos. They're doing it in the US, they're doing it in Russia, they're doing it in China, they're doing it everywhere across the world, in Europe too. They're all doing the same things. Digital IDs happening across the board. Digital currencies happening across the board. So this idea that there's some good guys and bad guys, no, it's a Hollywood film. It's a Marvel superhero action film that you're watching. The good guys versus the bad guys. That's not what this is. Every one of them wants to put you in this financial digital control and surveillance grid. And the only way they're going to do that is to firstly make you go in. So they're going to have to make you poor, get rid of your wealth, so you don't have any other options. The other options, of course, would be gold and silver. So they need to try and distract you from that. Buy this, buy that, buy Bitcoin. That's what Trump was telling you. Was Trump telling you to buy gold? No, of course he wasn't. He's getting gold. He's getting gold everything. And so that is the goal, is to get people into a position where they don't have a choice, and then they can force you into the system with UBI and just say, if you want to survive this crisis, which will be the greatest depression in human history, then here's what you have to do. You have to sign up to this digital ID. You have to get your UBI. Here's your tokens. Sorry you've lost your pension. Sorry your bank deposits have gone. That was the bad guys that did it. Don't look over there. Just keep going forwards. Here's another crisis. Here's another Hollywood narrative in the screen to distract you. Just keep going forwards, guys. Keep going forwards. And before you know it, you're 5 years into this system and you've got a social credit score and you're having to dance like a bear to get, you know, your next meal. So that's the goal, that's the plan. And of course, gold and silver make it possible for people to have choices. And on top of that, of course, you want to have that self-sufficiency. You want to go back to living like our ancestors did in the Great Depression, where they had control over their food, their water, their energy. And this can start simple. It started simple for me. I bought a water filter about 15, 16 years ago. That was the first little bit of self-sufficiency that I had. Very simple. I bought myself a really good water filter in America, Big Berkey or British Berkefeld, both of them you can find. I've got the British Berkefeld, very simple, gravity-fed ceramic candles in the top. If you use tap water, you can get fluoride filters for the bottom. If you don't use tap water, or you've got a spring or a well, you don't need those in the bottom, but you can just use the top ones. Gives you pure water. And for me, that was life-changing because I was an athlete. I would drink a lot of water, of course. And so I was like, wow, yeah, I'm taking back control over something very important. One simple change. And now for the rest of my life, I'm going to be drinking water that's not full of hormone disruptors, that's not full of illicit drugs, poisons, toxins from the environment, microplastics. It's going to get all of that out. And that was really a mental shift for me. And of course, later on, I learned about things like gold, silver, the fiat system. Then I thought, what about food? Going back to organic, healthy food, then going back to growing it. But for a long time, it was just incremental, step by step. So anyone can do these things, but of course, you have to take action. And the action should go the right direction, which is escaping this thing here, getting yourself protected financially, securing some land, and then allowing the rest of it to crumble whilst they reset the system. What you shouldn't be doing is going out of this bottom layer here and back into this system, which would be bank deposits, paper currencies, government bonds. That would be a really bad idea, but sadly, there are some people doing that. Now, why do I think people are not doing that in Central Europe? Why are people not doing that in Eastern Europe? Why are they buying more the higher the price goes? Why are they buying more when they see things like Greenland being on the table and Venezuelan oil and the Middle East war? Why are they buying more when they see that? Well, that's because they know their history. They haven't lived through decadent times. I often mention on the channel that my wife grew up during communism. So she literally remembers going to the stores when she was a young gal and there was nothing on the shelves. It was empty. There was only bread. That was it. You could buy some bread, and that was the only thing you could buy. And to get that bread, you had to queue up for an hour or 2 hours. She remembers nearly every day eating the same thing, which was sandwiches made with apples. So they'd pick up the apples off the floor. They'd go find some trees, apple trees, to just collect them. So that was free. And then they'd have bread. And that was every day the same thing because people were desperately poor and there was no food and there was no goods in the country. And people were so desperate to get rid of their currency because it was hyperinflating, they would buy anything that had potential value. I'm talking anything. So if we go back to the French hyperinflation, there was actually people at one point buying encyclopedias. I read about this in one of the history books. They was buying encyclopedias to store their wealth in because they couldn't get gold and silver anymore. That's how valuable gold and silver would have been to them. But they missed that boat, so they had to buy encyclopedias. Now, in Soviet Europe, where my in-laws were, my father-in-law, when the currency was hyperinflating, he walked around with his life savings in his back pocket, desperate to find an encyclopedia, a rusty old bike, a motorcycle helmet, anything to turn that dying fiat currency into something of value. And he once queued for 4 weeks. I'm not even joking. He stood in a queue for 4 weeks. The first 2 weeks was to try and get a rusty old washer that was coming in from Germany. And it was only a rumor. He had a rumor that there may be an old, used, battered washing machine. So he said, well, I need to get my hands on that because all I've got is this dying fiat currency that in 2 months, 3 months, a year is going to be worth maybe 2% of what it is now, maybe 1%. So he stood in that queue for 2 weeks. Now, how did he do it? Well, he did 12-hour shifts. He went to work for 12 hours, and then he'd come and stand in the queue for 12 hours, and his cousin did the opposite shift, and they just kept switching. Now, after 2 weeks, they got to the front of the queue. They bought the rusty old washing machine. And guess what? The guy said, well, there might be another. There might be another coming in another week or so. I have no idea. Just there might be another. So they went and stood in the queue again. Can you imagine the inefficiency and also just how mentally and psychologically destroying that would be to be like, yeah, I'm going to stand in a queue for another 2 weeks, having just done it. So that's the tough times that people have lived through over here. So when they see all of these events happening in the world, they say to themselves, oh, okay, I know what this is. I'm seeing the warning signs now of what was going on last time. And last time I wasn't ready for it. And this time I am ready for it. And they taught their children the same. So people over here know all about gold and silver. They know all about fiat currency hyperinflations. They know all about debt collapse. They know all about fascism and totalitarianism. All the things that are happening in the world right now, the very same things. People in Germany learnt the same during the Weimar hyperinflation. Which European nation has the highest level of domestic gold holdings? It's Germany, because they learnt their lesson. So people who have been through this know the warning signs and are now responding to them. The people who don't have that history, who haven't lived through this, they're selling their gold. They're selling their silver. And they think that there is going to be another 50, 100 years of this system, that they can kick the can forever and ever and ever. Well, it's not true. And the warning signs are now there. And this is something that I've been predicted on the channel for a long time. And I said, going into the end of this system, you'll see wars over commodities, wars over land, because those things are what are going to be the base of the next system. The next system is a value-based system. And that means all of the fictional notional value, the stuff of this system, is going to collapse. People are going to rush out of it and rush into the bottom levels, which is gold and silver as the foundation. Obviously, you can hold them with no counterparty risk. And then land and commodities. And those are the things that we are now seeing in the media and exploding, but people in the West don't understand it. And they're doing a really good job of getting people to think, well, gold's going up because of Donald Trump. No. If gold was going up for Donald Trump, I'd have predicted 5 years ago, gold's going to go up because of Donald Trump and Greenland and all of those things, but I didn't. I predicted it because of the financial system and the catastrophic levels of debt and the unfunded liabilities and the derivatives. That was the thesis, and that is why it's happening. We're just being given narratives to justify something so people believe, oh, well, it's all going to go back to normal. It ain't going back to normal. You're living through the reset. We're already a few years into it now, and gold obviously has doubled in just a few years. Silver's going crazy right now. And whilst there's going to be volatility, because that's what happens if you go back to the Weimar hyperinflation or any hyperinflation, prices start to go erratic up and down and haywire. And there was times in the Weimar hyperinflation when gold actually came down for a time, and of course silver would be the same. The same thing happened in the 1970s. Gold was up 23 times in a decade, which if we start in 2020 and apply the same returns, that would see us around $35,000 an ounce by the time we get to 2030. And we are actually on course for that. If we see gold do another 70% per annum this year and next year and the year afterwards, you're going to be up towards $30,000 an ounce already. That's the exponential growth that happens during these periods. So even in the 1970s, when you had that decade-long 23 times bull run, there was a period of 400 days where gold turned back down and it lost 50% of its value. And that was because the Federal Reserve did an attack on gold. They started dumping massive amounts of their gold to bring the price down. Of course, it didn't work. And so, yeah, I expect it's going to be a rocky road. There's going to be certainly lots of deceptions, but ultimately the system is now unwinding in real time. That's why in 2025, which was a year of tremendous risk in the markets, you saw the tariffs, the market had a flash crash, the AI and tech narrative started to fall apart towards the end of the year. We got to peer behind the curtain of this very opaque private credit bubble. So all of these risks were manifesting, and where did people rush into? Where did the smart money rush into? They rushed into gold, the true safe haven of the system. And yet you was being told at the start of the year to buy Bitcoin. That was what you have been told is a safe haven, but we saw last year it's not a safe haven. And that's something I've been saying from the start. It's not a safe haven. It's correlated with the riskiest part of the markets. And in a year of tremendous risk, it was the asset that performed the worst. And that's because people were rushing into the real safe haven, which is gold and then later silver. And the reason they went into silver is, of course, because now we're seeing nations like China hodl silver. That's what they're doing. They're not hodling Bitcoin, they're hodling silver, as much of it as possible, because they understand we're bifurcating and the world's going back to might is right, and commodities are where it's at, along with gold and silver. And China already have a lot of gold, but they need silver too, because it's critical in industry. So the market participants now that don't understand what's happening, yes, they're going to be deceived. They're going to be told to go back into the stupid Ponzi assets that are going to be crushed in the end game, taken from them, or just going to go to zero because they disappear. And that's really the aim, is to capture you in this massive dragnet. It's like those fishing boats that use these dragnets that are thousands of feet wide, and they drag them across the ocean floor to try and capture the fish, but they also just destroy the ocean floor. Well, that's where they want you, in that dragnet, which is in financialized assets, digital assets, things that can be easily controlled. And they don't want you in the zero counterparty risk assets of gold and silver. And so many people now are out of the dragnet. They've escaped it. They was in the right position, but they're actually swimming back into the dragnet, which is a terrible thing to do. I would say try and avoid doing that, because ultimately you won't be happy with where you end up once this system is reset. So I think that's a good place to leave this one, everyone. Thank you for listening. Please let me know in the comments section if you are a seller, a holder, or a buyer. Please let me know. Also, please check out the Substack. If you are not watching this on Substack, you can find my paid for members content. I've got some great articles about how you can profit during these times using things like the gold and silver ratio, lots on wealth preservation, which is absolutely crucial because the goal is to take your wealth. And there's some articles as well on the great taking, including an article called How to Protect Yourself from the Great Taking, which goes through my Citadel strategy. So in closing, take care of yourselves, everyone. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.